1939, Hitler marched into Poland, and that ignited World War II and his quest for conquering Europe and the ethnic cleansing of getting rid of all of the Jewish people. Now, we tried to stay out of the conflict just like we had in World War I, but in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he went to Congress and asked Congress to declare war. And once we did, we declared war. That launched us into World War II. And 71,000 men from Utah went into the war. Now, we were in the Great Depression from 1929 up until really we started gearing up for the war effort. And with that, because it brought us out of the Great Depression, because it provided people with jobs. People were now doing manufacturing jobs. People were also obviously going into the army. But when the men left their jobs in the United States and in Utah as well, obviously to go and fight in the war, that meant that women were now coming into the workforce for the first time on such a big scale. Women had been in the workforce for a long, long time. Obviously, but not on such a great scale almost. Because of all those jobs that were left, women now were moving into the workforce, and they were helping build airplanes, and they were doing these manufacturing jobs, helping create supplies and sending them to Europe for the war effort, for not only us, but for France and for England as well, our allies. Utah was a huge part of that because we had a huge copper mine. The Kennecott copper mine provided 1/3 of the copper used by allies in World War II. Also, we had a huge steel industry here. We provided that steel for shipbuilding, for warships during World War II. We also had iron right here in Cedar City. This memorial's in Cedar City. So right here in Cedar City, we had the iron mines as well that were helping for the war efforts. You also had something else that's kind of interesting that comes from Utah as well as New Mexico and Arizona, were the Navajo code talkers. We had Navajo people that were also helping with the war, and they were a huge part into helping us beat the Nazis during World War II, because these men, these 350 men from Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, they were sending messages in their Navajo language and back and forth. And when the Germans and the Japanese would try to intercept them, they could not figure out what these messages were. They didn't know that it was an actual language. They thought it was a code, and they could not decipher the code because it was an actual language. It was part of the Navajo language. And so these people were called Navajo code talkers, and they were a huge, huge part in us winning the war. Also in Utah, we had Hill Air Force Base, and we had a lot of training military bases for pilots because our area was so open that it was good for training pilots. Also in Wendover, which is on the border of Nevada and Utah. At Wendover, that is where the pilots trained for dropping the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to help end the war in the Pacific, with the Japanese helping end the war. That they trained in Utah on the border of Nevada and Utah in Wendover. And so we had a lot of military bases here. We had jobs that were helping provide supplies and munitions and tools and shipbuilding for the war effort. And it brought us out of the Great Depression, which was really a big thing. But we also have a lot of people who died, obviously, during this. Now, back behind me is the World War II Memorial in Cedar City. And it is a pretty cool place. Actually, they have a great memorial here for war veterans. It is amazing. So this is, there's the world for World War II. And then back over here on these plaques are the names recognizing the people who served during this war. Within this war memorial, it's pretty cool, actually. They have a monument to all of the different wars here. They have World War I, as I did in the previous video. They have World War II, and then they also have the Korean War Memorial, which I wanted to show you. That's what I'm walking down to now. I wanted to show you this. Oh man, it's just really neat, and it's almost reminiscent of the war memorials in Washington, D.C. Obviously, it's not as large, it's not as big, but it's pretty open. They tried to make it open so people could come here and enjoy and just reminisce and think about all of the people that sacrificed for the freedoms that we have. So this is the Korean memorial with the statue on either side of South Korea. You can see the dividing line under his feet, North Korea and South Korea. And then all along here you also have names in those plaques behind me, but also around it there's information and stories about this war. And then down here I have two more that I want to show you, and I think you guys should come here. It's in Cedar City. It's really cool. Definitely check it out sometime, especially if you have family members who were in any of these wars. And even if they're not from Cedar, it's still a really neat place to come and tell stories, really, even of your family members that you know who were involved in any of these conflicts, especially if they were from Cedar, but not even necessarily from Cedar. But here is the memorial for all of these names back behind me on these bricks. These are actually for the war in Afghanistan. And I wanted to show you, they have a nice statue here for the war in Afghanistan, and all of these names on these bricks for recognizing all these people who served in the current war. And a lot of you probably know people who are serving now in the military. But these are people who have been recognized from Cedar City specifically for the current war. Now, and sometimes I feel like when we say like the United States Navy and the United States Air Force and the Marines and the Army, sometimes we forget that they come from every state. Because they're American, which is great, but sometimes we forget that they're individuals and they come from all these different states. And so I think it's great that Cedar City has taken it upon themselves to recognize all of these people in this war memorial for the people who have served in their city. Now, the last one I wanted to show you is actually it is the Vietnam Memorial. And the Vietnam Memorial has more of a special significance to me because my dad was in Vietnam. And he wasn't from Cedar City. He was actually from Indiana. But any Vietnam War memorial always has a significance to me because of my dad. And he was actually a part of the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne. He was trained as a paratrooper, so we jumped out of airplanes. But when he got to Vietnam, he was actually a clerk, and that meant that when the people who had died in his company came back to their camp, and he would have to identify them. He would have to identify the bodies. So it was not a very nice job at all, and he didn't really talk much about it. And a lot of Vietnam veterans don't talk about it because of their horrible experiences, but also the way that they were treated when they came home. A lot of people during this conflict, a lot of people protested the war, which they have every right to do. But the problem is because they didn't support it, sometimes they would take their blame out on the veterans when they came home. And that's what happened with the Vietnam veterans. My dad told me a story once where, as I said, he actually came to school in Cedar City. He went to SU and he was a track star. He was a runner for their track team and cross-country team. And when people found out that he had served in Vietnam, they would spit in his face. And I found that very, very sad and disheartening, because I understand if people didn't agree with the war, but to take it out on these veterans who had served there, and most veterans didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice whether they served or not. They were drafted into Vietnam. My dad volunteered to go before he was drafted, but he would have been drafted. And that's what happened to a lot of veterans. And so I love Vietnam veteran memorials, because, like this one, because Vietnam veterans don't get the respect they deserve. They don't get recognized as they should, because the Vietnam War and the conflict seemed to be so controversial, and a lot of people didn't like it, that they don't get the respect that they deserve for going out and fighting and representing their country. And so I'm so happy that Cedar City has provided this place for Vietnam veterans and their families to come and be recognized for the freedoms that they were fighting for. Even if people didn't agree with the war, they did what they were asked to do. They did what they were asked to do. So here you have the memorial behind me, and then up on those plaques you have some information about the Vietnam conflict, and down here you have names on the ground of these people who had served. So always make sure you recognize all the different wars, and that these were individual people. These were actual people who fought in these different wars. And if you know any veterans or people who are serving now, thank them.